The intergalactic trade station Omega-7 hung in the void like a chrome-plated monument to bureaucratic excess, its 17 levels of rotating rings and crystalline spires, somehow managing to look both futuristic and utterly boring at the same time. If one were to judge civilizations by their architecture, the station screamed, "We have advanced beyond the need for interesting design," with all the subtlety of a neutron star collision. Inside this gleaming testament to galactic cooperation, the usual suspects had gathered for what the propaganda feeds generously called a trade summit for mutual prosperity. Translation: another opportunity for the established powers to divide up resources, while pretending the newer species had actual voting rights. The Zephyrian delegates floated in their crystalline bubbles, their translucent forms pulsing with the kind of ethereal light that screamed, "We're so evolved we barely need physical forms anymore." Next to them, the Corvan representatives sat in perfect geometric formations, their chitinous shells gleaming with mathematical precision that made slide rules weep with envy. The Vorthan contingent had claimed the highest perches, naturally, their six-limbed forms draped in what could only be described as the galactic equivalent of business casual, if business casual involved enough precious metals to fund a small war. Their compound eyes swept the assembly with the kind of benevolent condescension typically reserved for pets attempting to use tools. And then there were the Andromeda. If the galaxy had a species specifically designed to make everyone else feel inadequate, the Andromedans would have won that particular evolutionary lottery. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, their muscular frames suggested they had evolved from predators who hunted other predators for sport, then probably critiqued their technique afterward. Their skin held the metallic sheen of polished gunmetal, and their eyes, those glorious, arrogant eyes, burned with the confidence of a species that had never encountered a problem they couldn't solve by applying superior firepower and overwhelming smugness. The Andromedan military commander stood at the center of his delegation like a monument to controlled violence, his ceremonial armor managing to look both decorative and terrifyingly functional. His presence alone had caused 3 different species to unconsciously shift their seating arrangements to what they probably thought was a more respectful distance. The commander's subordinates flanked him in perfect formation, their synchronized movements suggesting they had practiced walking in step until it became an art form. This was the established order of things. The Andromedans provided security, the Zephyrians handled the mystical philosophical nonsense, the Corvans managed the mathematics, and the Vorthans distributed the profit. It was a system that had worked for roughly 4 centuries, which in galactic terms was approximately 15 minutes, but everyone pretended it was as eternal as the stars themselves. Into this carefully orchestrated display of species superiority walked the human representative. She entered the chamber with the kind of casual confidence that immediately set every alien nervous system on high alert, not because she appeared threatening, but because she appeared utterly unimpressed. While other species had arrived with elaborate entourages, ceremonial robes, and enough pomp to choke a space whale, the human female wore what could only be described as professional attire that somehow managed to look both appropriate and completely out of place. Her hair was pulled back in a style that suggested she had more important things to worry about than elaborate grooming rituals, and her expression held the patient weariness of someone who had sat through too many meetings, where the people talking had no idea what they were talking about. She carried herself with the relaxed posture of someone who had nothing to prove, and no particular desire to be anywhere else, which was perhaps the most unsettling thing about her entire presence. The established delegates watched her approach with the kind of fascination typically reserved for exotic zoo specimens. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, a mere 50 years since first contact, and most species hadn't quite figured out what to make of them yet. They weren't particularly large, fast, or technologically advanced. They didn't possess the Zephyrians' ethereal wisdom, the Corvans' mathematical precision, or the Vorthans' economic cunning. They certainly didn't have the Andromedans' obvious physical superiority. What they did have, apparently, was the audacity to show up to important meetings without proper deference, adequate fear, or even the courtesy to seem appropriately intimidated by their obvious betters. The human female took her designated seat, carefully positioned to ensure she understood her place in the hierarchy, and calmly began organizing her materials with the methodical efficiency of someone who actually intended to work rather than simply posture. Her actions sent subtle ripples of confusion through the assembly, as if she had somehow missed the memo that this was primarily a theater performance with trade negotiations as a distant secondary concern. The Andromedan commander's attention had focused on her with the intensity of a targeting system locking onto an unexpected variable. His expression suggested he was trying to determine whether her behavior represented ignorance, disrespect, or some cunning strategy beyond his immediate comprehension. The tension in the chamber had begun to build like pressure in a faulty reactor core, and everyone present could feel it, except, apparently, the human female, who continued her preparations with the serene focus of someone completely oblivious to the fact that she was supposed to be intimidated. The proceedings began with the traditional exchange of pleasantries, which in galactic diplomatic terms meant approximately 47 minutes of ritualized posturing, disguised as cultural appreciation. The Zephyrian speaker floated forward first, delivering what sounded like poetry, but was actually a carefully constructed insult about the younger species, needing guidance from their more experienced stellar neighbors. The translator circuits worked overtime to convert phrases like primitive understanding into more diplomatically palatable terms like developing perspectives. The fourth and trade minister followed with a presentation that could have been titled Mathematics How We're Better at It Than You, complete with holographic displays showing economic projections that somehow always concluded with the established powers receiving the larger share of profits. Their six-limbed gestures transformed the air into a symphony of condescension, each movement calculated to remind everyone present exactly where they stood in the cosmic food chain. The Corvan delegate contributed their traditional offering of bureaucratic efficiency, presenting trade regulations that read like love letters to red tape. Their chitinous shells clicked in rhythmic patterns that probably sounded like applause to their own species, but reminded everyone else of insects preparing to devour something considerably smaller than themselves. Through it all, the human female sat with the patience of someone who had clearly dealt with middle management before. She took notes with the methodical precision of someone who actually intended to remember what was being discussed, which was apparently such an unusual concept that several delegates kept glancing at her with barely concealed bewilderment. When her turn finally arrived, she stood with the fluid grace of someone who had never questioned her right to occupy space in the universe. Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone who had spent years explaining complex concepts to people who should have understood them the first time. Earth's proposals are straightforward, she began, activating her own holographic display with the casual efficiency of someone who viewed technology as a tool rather than a status symbol. We offer rare earth elements, agricultural products, and manufacturing capability. In exchange, we seek access to faster-than-light communication networks and medical technologies. The presentation that followed was a masterclass in professional competence. No flowery language, no ritualistic dancing around the subject, no elaborate metaphors about stellar harmony. Just facts, figures, and logical arguments presented with the kind of straightforward clarity that made everyone else's contributions look like doctoral dissertations on the art of saying nothing eloquent. The Andromedan commander's expression had been growing progressively darker throughout the human's presentation, his metallic features settling into the kind of scowl typically reserved for subordinates who had failed to polish their armor to mirror brightness. His massive frame tensed with each passing minute, as if the very act of listening to a human speak with confidence was causing him physical discomfort. "These terms are unacceptable," he rumbled when she finished, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had presumably ended countless discussions before they could become actual negotiations. "Perhaps in another century, when you've learned proper respect for your betters." The human female's response was a smile that somehow managed to be both professional and absolutely terrifying. "With respect, Commander, our technological integration assessments suggest otherwise. We're prepared to demonstrate our capabilities if necessary." The word respect had been delivered with the kind of precision that suggested she understood exactly how much of it she was actually offering, which was roughly equivalent to the amount of vacation time a neutron star might grant to visiting particles. The commander's eyes narrowed to slits that could have cut through battleship armor. "You forget yourself, human. This is not your primitive world where you can speak to your superiors without consequence." "I'm not speaking to my superiors," she replied with the calm certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. "I'm speaking to potential trading partners who seem to have confused negotiations with intimidation." The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when someone accidentally triggers a diplomatic incident with the efficiency of a precision-guided munition. Every delegate in the chamber suddenly found themselves reconsidering their assumptions about human social dynamics, particularly their apparent inability to recognize when they were supposed to be afraid. The Andromedan commander rose from his seat with the fluid menace of a predator who had just spotted prey foolish enough to challenge his authority. His towering form cast shadows across the chamber as he moved toward the human delegation with steps that resonated like drum beats announcing an execution. "Perhaps," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his previous roar, "you need a lesson in proper respect." The human female remained seated, her posture relaxed, her expression attentive. She watched his approach with the kind of professional interest typically reserved for studying interesting but ultimately harmless phenomena. When he reached her position, the commander's massive hand rose in a gesture that every species present recognized as the prelude to violence. The chamber held its collective breath as 3 meters of engineered killing machine prepared to demonstrate why humans needed to learn their place in the galactic order. The slap, when it came, echoed through the chamber with the finality of a gavel ending a trial. The human female's head snapped to the side from the impact, her hair falling across her face as she absorbed the blow that would have rendered most species unconscious. The metallic ring of the commander's hand meeting human flesh seemed to hang in the air like a challenge to the very concept of diplomatic immunity. For a moment, the universe paused to consider the implications of what had just occurred. Then the human female slowly turned her head back toward the Andromedan commander, her hair falling away from her face to reveal an expression that made every witness suddenly remember they had urgent business elsewhere. Her smile had not changed in the slightest, but something behind her eyes had shifted with the subtle finality of a weapon being armed. What happened next would later be analyzed by military strategists across 17 different star systems, broken down into slow-motion holographic reconstructions, and generally agreed upon as the moment when the galaxy's understanding of human capabilities required a complete software update. The human female moved with the kind of liquid precision that made professional assassins weep with envy and physics professors question their understanding of reaction times. Her body uncoiled from the chair like a spring-loaded weapon that had been disguised as office furniture, every motion flowing into the next with the seamless efficiency of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of controlled violence. The first second belonged to momentum transfer. Her right hand, which had been resting casually on her datapad, swept upward in an arc that would have made ballistic engineers applaud. The edge of her palm connected with the commander's wrists just as he was beginning to process the fact that his victim was no longer sitting passively in her chair. The impact produced a sound like a tree branch snapping, followed immediately by the commander's weapon hand going completely numb as several key nerve clusters decided they no longer wished to participate in the evening's festivity. Simultaneously, her left foot had somehow relocated itself behind the commander's ankle, applying leverage with the kind of mathematical precision that would have made the Corvins weep with joy if they hadn't been too busy diving for cover. The laws of physics, being remarkably consistent across all known galaxies, responded predictably to the sudden redistribution of a 3-meter-tall alien center of gravity. The second was devoted to educational physics. The commander's massive frame began its inevitable journey toward the floor, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief and the dawning realization that he was no longer in control of his own vertical orientation. His arms windmilled frantically, seeking purchase on something that might halt his descent, while his brain struggled to process how someone a full meter shorter than him had managed to violate several fundamental assumptions about leverage and mass distribution. The human female, meanwhile, had somehow repositioned herself to be exactly where the commander's face would be when gravity finished its work. Her right fist was already traveling on an intercept course that would have impressed orbital mechanics specialists, her knuckles aligned with the kind of precision typically reserved for docking maneuvers between spacecraft. The third second delivered the educational finale. The commander's face met the human's fist with the kind of impact that suggested someone had been secretly studying alien physiology with the dedication of a doctoral candidate preparing for comprehensive exam. The blow landed precisely on the nerve cluster that controlled Andromedan motor functions, a fact that would have been impressive if anyone had bothered to mention that humans weren't supposed to know about Andromedan neurological weak point. The sound of impact echoed through the chamber like a gunshot in a library, followed immediately by the considerably louder sound of 3 meters of unconscious alien hitting the floor with the finality of a condemned building meeting its demolition charges. The commander's body struck the polished floor of the diplomatic chamber with enough force to make the artificial gravity generators briefly question their career choices. His limbs sprawled in directions that suggested his nervous system had decided to take an unscheduled vacation, while his face displayed the kind of expression typically seen on people who had just discovered that their understanding of reality required significant revision. A pool of what could charitably be called alien blood began forming beneath his head, though its iridescent silver color made it look more like expensive hydraulic fluid than anything biological. His breathing came in shallow gasps that suggested his respiratory system was still trying to figure out what had just happened to the rest of his body. The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when an entire room full of supposedly intelligent beings suddenly realizes they need to recalibrate their entire understanding of a fundamental concept. Every delegate present found themselves staring at the unconscious Andromedan commander, then at the human female, then back at the commander, as if repeated observation might somehow make the scene make sense. The human female stood over the commander's prone form with the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the negotiations, her breathing barely elevated, her clothing still perfectly arranged. She brushed an imaginary speck of dust from her sleeve with the casual gesture of someone who had just completed a minor administrative task, rather than rendering unconscious the galaxy's most feared military commander. As I was saying, she continued in the same conversational tone she had used for her trade presentation. Earth is prepared to demonstrate our capabilities when necessary. The Zephyrian delegates had stopped glowing, their ethereal forms flickering like candles in a hurricane. The Vorthan trade minister's 6 limbs had frozen in mid-gesture, creating a tableau that suggested someone had paused a particularly dramatic dance performance. The Corvan representatives' chitinous shells had locked into a defensive posture that probably looked impressive in their homeworld's nature documentaries, but mainly made them resemble very large, very frightened insects. The other Andromedan soldiers, who had been standing at perfect attention throughout the proceedings, now found themselves facing a tactical situation that their training had never quite covered. Their commanding officer was unconscious. Their species' reputation for invincibility was leaking hydraulic fluid onto the floor, and the small human female was looking at them with the kind of patient expectation typically reserved for teachers waiting for particularly slow students to work out a simple math problem. One of the junior officers made the mistake of reaching for his weapon, a movement that caused the human female to tilt her head slightly in his direction. The gesture was so subtle that most species would have missed it entirely, but something about the way she shifted her weight made every Andromedan in the room suddenly decide that their weapons were perfectly fine exactly where they were. "I believe," the human female said, her voice carrying the kind of reasonable authority that made resistance seem not just futile but actively embarrassing. "We were discussing trade agreement." The chamber remained frozen in the kind of silence that occurs when everyone present is simultaneously trying to process the same impossible event. The unconscious commander continued to leak silver fluid onto the floor, his breathing the only sound in a room full of beings who had just watched their understanding of galactic power dynamics get drop-kicked into a parallel dimension. The human female returned to her seat with the same fluid grace she had demonstrated while dismantling the commander, her movements suggesting that brief explosions of violence were simply another tool in her diplomatic arsenal, no different from pie charts or statistical analysis. She smiled at the assembled delegates with the warm professionalism of someone who had just successfully completed a routine business presentation. The ripple effects of 3 seconds of educational violence spread through the galaxy faster than a supernova's shockwave, carried by the kind of diplomatic communications that typically reserve their urgency for impending apocalypses or really good gossip. Within hours, emergency sessions were being called on 17 different worlds. Military advisors were hastily revising their threat assessments, and anthropologists were frantically updating their files on human behavioral patterns. The Zephyrian High Council, who had spent the last 4 centuries floating serenely above the concerns of lesser species, suddenly found themselves very interested in the precise details of human military training. Their ethereal forms flickered with what could only be described as nervous energy as they reviewed footage of the incident with the kind of attention typically reserved for religious texts or mathematical proofs. The Vorthian Economic Consortium discovered that their carefully calculated projections had failed to account for the variable of humans who could render their security forces unconscious with the casual efficiency of someone swatting flies. Their six-limbed forms gestured frantically as they recalculated profit margins that now had to factor in the possibility that their junior partners might not be quite as junior as previously assumed. The Corvin Mathematical Institute found themselves grappling with equations that had suddenly become significantly more complex. Their precise calculations of galactic power dynamics had been based on the assumption that physical prowess correlated directly with size and technological advancement. The human female's demonstration had introduced variables that made their previous formulas look like elementary arithmetic. But it was the Andromedan military command that experienced the most dramatic reassessment of their place in the universe. Emergency meetings convened with the kind of urgency typically reserved for full-scale invasion, as generals who had never questioned their species' physical superiority suddenly found themselves confronting the uncomfortable reality that their reputation for invincibility had been built on the shaky foundation of never having encountered anyone who actually knew how to fight. Back on Trade Station Omega 7, the immediate aftermath played out with the surreal quality of a fever dream. Medical personnel had arrived to collect the unconscious commander, their professional demeanor struggling to mask their bewilderment at finding the galaxy's most feared warrior laid out like a dropped anvil. The pool of silver fluid had been cleaned up with the kind of thorough efficiency that suggested the janitorial staff had dealt with diplomatic incidents before, though probably not quite like this one. The human female, meanwhile, had returned to her presentation materials with the serene focus of someone who had simply cleared a minor obstruction from the proceeding. Her datapad glowed with charts and graphs that suddenly seemed significantly more relevant to the assembled delegates, who were viewing Earth's trade proposals with the kind of attention typically reserved for surrender terms. As I was explaining, she continued, her voice carrying the same professional warmth it had held before the brief interruption, Earth's manufacturing capabilities are more flexible than our initial reports might have suggested. The understatement of the millennium hung in the air like a challenge to the very concept of diplomatic language. The assembled delegates found themselves nodding with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for agreeing with people who had just demonstrated their ability to render 3-meter-tall warriors unconscious in the time it took to sneeze. The Zephyrian speaker floated forward with considerably less ethereal confidence than before, their translucent form flickering with what might have been nervousness, or possibly just a sudden appreciation for the complexities of human social dynamics. Perhaps, they said, their voice carrying none of its previous condescension, we should reconsider the terms of technological exchange. The Vorthian trade minister's 6 limbs moved in patterns that suggested they were rapidly calculating the cost-benefit analysis of continuing to treat humans as junior partners, versus the potential expense of being on the receiving end of another educational demonstration. Earth's proposals seem quite reasonable, they said, their voice carrying the kind of respect typically reserved for people who held the keys to nuclear arsenals. The Corvin delegates' chitinous shells clicked in rhythms that had shifted from bureaucratic superiority to something that sounded suspiciously like nervous applause. We believe expedited processing of these agreements would be beneficial for all parties involved. The human female smiled with the warm professionalism of someone who had just watched her negotiating position improve by several orders of magnitude. I'm glad we could reach an understanding, she said, her tone suggesting that the understanding in question involved more than just trade agreement. The remaining Andromedan soldiers stood at attention with the kind of rigid discipline that suggested they had suddenly discovered religion, or at least a healthy respect for the consequences of poor behavior. Their commander's unconscious form had been removed, but the lesson remained written in the precise arrangement of their posture and the careful way they avoided making eye contact with the human delegation. Within the following days, trade agreements that had been expected to take months of negotiation were finalized with the kind of efficiency that would have impressed even the Corvins. Earth's requests for advanced medical technology were approved without the usual decades of bureaucratic review. Access to faster-than-light communication networks was granted with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for giving presents to heavily armed relatives. The human female's personal communication device had begun receiving messages from species that had previously considered humans too primitive to warrant direct contact. Invitations to cultural exchanges, requests for military consultation, and offers of technological cooperation flooded in with the kind of volume that suggested the galaxy had suddenly discovered that Earth might be worth paying attention to after all. The irony was not lost on the more philosophically inclined observers that the galaxy's most civilized species had spent centuries defining civilization in terms of their ability to avoid violence, while the supposedly primitive humans had just demonstrated that true civilization might actually require the wisdom to know when violence was the most efficient solution to a problem. As the human female packed her materials and prepared to depart Trade Station Omega 7, she did so with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed a routine business trip. Her mission had been accomplished, her species' position in the galactic community had been substantially improved, and she had done it all without breaking a single diplomatic protocol that actually mattered. The galaxy had spent 4 centuries operating under the assumption that respect was something that could be demanded through superiority and enforced through intimidation. It had taken 3 seconds of educational violence to demonstrate that respect was actually something that had to be earned through competence and maintained through the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to announce itself. As her transport prepared to depart, the human female looked back at the trade station with the mild satisfaction of someone who had just solved a particularly stubborn problem. The galaxy would never be quite the same, but then again, it probably needed the adjustment anyway. The age of assuming humans were harmless had ended with the sound of an Andromedan commander hitting the floor. The age of treating them as equals had begun with the quiet professionalism of someone who had never doubted that equality was exactly what they deserved.